August 8, 1942. The waters off Savo Island lie suffocated beneath a moonless tropical overcast. A heavy, blinding squall reduces visibility to zero. Aboard the American cruisers patrolling the narrow channel known as the Slot, weary lookouts strain their eyes against the relentless black. They see nothing but rain. They hear nothing but the thrum of their own turbines. But just beyond the veil of the storm, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's strike force is already there. 7 Imperial Japanese Navy cruisers slice through the heavy swells in perfect silence, running completely darkened. Their elite lookouts, trained to spot the silhouette of a mast miles away using only starlight, have been tracking the American formation for over an hour. Suddenly, brilliant white flares burst overhead, instantly blinding the American crews. Parachutes of magnesium fire burn intensely against the low clouds. Before the Allied gunners can even comprehend the geometry of the ambush, the ocean erupts. Japanese 8-inch shells tear through steel bulkheads. Torpedoes shatter hulls, instantly converting sleeping warships into burning iron coffins. In the absolute dark, a blind giant has been gutted, exposing a brutal reality of the early Pacific theater. The massacre at Savo Island was not an accident of weather or a stroke of blind luck. It was the flawless execution of a military doctrine decades in the making. In the years following the First World War, the Imperial Japanese Navy found itself mathematically outgunned by international law. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had restricted their capital ship tonnage to a strict ratio, granting them only 3 battleships for every 5 possessed by the United States and Great Britain. To Japanese naval planners, a daylight clash of battle lines against a numerically superior HEAVI armored foe was calculated suicide. They needed an equalizer to whittle down the American fleet before the decisive daylight battle could occur. They found their equalizer in the darkness. The Imperial Navy dedicated itself entirely to mastering Yasen night combat. While Western navies historically viewed the night as a time to break contact, regroup, and avoid friendly fire, the Japanese trained relentlessly to turn the pitch-black ocean into a tactical slaughterhouse. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, or the decisive battle, dictated that the American fleet had to be bled dry as it crossed the Pacific. Night combat was the ultimate bleeding mechanism. Their strategy relied on stealth, rapid infiltration, and the devastating, synchronized use of torpedoes long before a single gun was fired. To achieve this unprecedented level of nighttime coordination, they weaponized the human body. High atop the towering, pagoda-style masts of Japanese cruisers and battleships stood the fleet's most valuable asset. They were the lookouts, sailors selected specifically for their biologically exceptional night vision. These men were subjected to a brutal monastic training regimen. They were fed a specialized, highly regulated diet rich in fish livers to maximize vitamin A intake, enhancing their retinal sensitivity. Before taking their posts, they spent hours in darkened compartments to ensure their pupils were dilated to maximum capacity. During rigorous fleet exercises, they were forced to stare into the blackness until their eyes wept with fatigue. Trained to detect the faintest visual disruptions on the horizon, the slight phosphorescence of a foaming bow wave, the vague silhouette of a mast against the starlight, or the momentary, fatal glow of a carelessly lit cigarette on an enemy deck miles away, these highly conditioned human sensors were augmented by the finest optical technology on the planet. Japanese engineers had developed massive tripod-mounted binoculars, the legendary Nikko 20 power with 120mm objective lenses. These heavy, precisely machined instruments did not just magnify distant objects. They gathered ambient starlight, turning a virtually invisible ocean into a readable tactical landscape. A seasoned Japanese lookout, peering through these massive optics on a moonless night, could spot an unlit Allied cruiser at over 8,000 yards. Yet, spotting the enemy was only the first phase of the kill. The true terror of the Japanese night attack lay in the weapon they unleashed. The Imperial Navy had secretly developed the Type 93 torpedo, known to history as the Long Lance, driven by pure, highly compressed oxygen rather than standard compressed air. The Long Lance left no visible trail of exhaust bubbles on the surface. It was a silent, invisible assassin that could deliver a massive, 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead over 20 miles at blistering speeds. Japanese destroyer squadrons were trained to maneuver within mere yards of one another at high speeds, using only dim blue stern lights for station keeping. It was a deadly synchronized ballet on the high seas, unleashing walls of these wakeless torpedoes in perfect silence, waiting for the devastating underwater detonations before instantly illuminating the crippled enemy with searchlights and opening fire. To the Japanese high command, this combination of sensory supremacy and lethal range was more than just a tactical advantage. It was a physical manifestation of Yamato Damashi, the invincible Japanese martial spirit. They believed that night fighting required an unparalleled level of discipline, aggression, and spiritual endurance that the decadent, comfort-loving Westerners simply did not possess. In the minds of the Imperial officers, machines could fail, but the rigorously trained human eye and the warrior's spirit were absolute. This deep-seated cultural hubris created a profound strategic blind spot, blinding them to a technological revolution that was slowly taking shape in the radio frequencies humming through the very air they breathed. While the Japanese perfected the art of seeing in the dark with flesh and polished glass, the United States Navy was struggling to interpret crude, flickering green lines bouncing across a cathode ray tube. Radar radio detection and ranging was still in its technological infancy when the Pacific War violently erupted. The early American systems deployed to the fleet, primarily the CXAM and SC air search radars, were massive, fragile, and deeply misunderstood by the men fighting the ships. These primitive electronic eyes were designed primarily for early warning against high-flying aircraft. Operating on long metric wavelengths, they were blunt instruments, easily confused by the complex geography and atmospheric conditions of the South Pacific. A nearby volcanic island, a heavy tropical rain squall, or even the surface clutter generated by high ocean swells could flood the circular screen with massive, glowing false returns. Furthermore, the phenomenon of atmospheric ducting in the hot, humid Pacific air often bent these long radar waves over the horizon or straight down into the sea, creating phantom echoes or completely hiding actual enemy warships. To the enlisted radar operators, staring at the glowing oscilloscope deep in a ship's sweltering hull, the world was a chaotic, unreliable mess of electronic noise. This inherent unreliability bred deep, often fatal suspicion among American naval commanders. Ship captains in 1942 were products of a traditional, gun club navy. They had spent 30 years learning to trust the salt spray on their faces, the geometry of their heavy optical rangefinders, and the visual reports of the seasoned officers standing beside them on the bridge wings. To be told by a young technically trained but combat inexperienced ensign locked in a dark compartment that an invisible enemy was lurking 10 miles away seemed like dangerous technological voodoo. There were a few forward-thinking American officers who possessed a deep understanding of electronics and recognized the untapped, world-shifting potential of radar. But in the early days of the war, these progressive voices were often drowned out by the traditionalist hierarchy. At the disaster of Savo Island, the commanding officers positioned their ships based on line of sight and optical limitations, inadvertently creating massive, fatal gaps in their defensive lines. The radar-equipped American picket destroyers USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot had Vice Admiral Mikawa's strike force slipped right past them. The operators were fatigued, and their rudimentary radar sets simply failed to distinguish the incoming Japanese steel hulls from the massive radar reflections of nearby Savo and Florida islands, even when early radar did successfully pick up a valid surface contact. The primitive, disjointed communication systems aboard American cruisers caused fatal delays. The process was agonizingly slow, relaying a bearing over a sound-powered telephone from the radar room, manually plotting it on a paper chart in the pilot house, calculating a firing solution, and transmitting that data to the gun directors took precious minutes. Against the 40-knot speed of a long-lance torpedo already slicing through the water, a 2-minute communication delay meant absolute destruction. Japanese naval intelligence was fully aware that the Americans possessed radar technology. They routinely intercepted the electronic emissions, and their ground forces had captured early British sets in Singapore and American models in the Philippines. But Imperial commanders analyzed the bulky, unreliable equipment and collectively scoffed. They viewed radar strictly as a defensive crutch, a heavy, fragile machine needed by a weak enemy who lacked the martial spirit to fight face-to-face in the terrifying dark. Japanese admirals vehemently argued that emitting a radar pulse was akin to turning on a flashlight in a pitch-black room. It would only give away a ship's precise position, completely ruining the element of surprise that was the cornerstone of their offensive doctrine. They chose to rely entirely on the biological superiority of their lookouts, believing firmly that the human eye, sharpened by samurai discipline, would always outmatch a clumsy vacuum tube. They were correct, but only temporarily. Throughout the blood-soaked campaigns of 1942, the Japanese utterly dominated the night, inflicting staggering, humiliating losses on the Allied fleets. But the United States Navy was actively learning from its brutal lessons. The scattered, burning wreckage littering the floor of Iron Bottom Sound served as a terrifying catalyst for change. American engineers, scientists, and surviving tacticians began to realize that their raw technology was not the core problem. The problem was the wavelength, the hardware, and the stubborn human minds trying to use it. The United States was about to stop fighting the darkness and start engineering a completely new way to conquer it. To conquer the darkness, the United States first had to understand the biological machine they were fighting. The Imperial Japanese Navy had pushed human physiology to its absolute breaking point. High atop the swaying pagoda masts, exposed to biting winds and relentless salt spray, Japanese lookouts endured an exhausting, unnatural existence. Their daily lives were heavily regulated, their bodies chemically manipulated to serve the Emperor's tactical vision. Their diets were tightly controlled, overloaded with eel and concentrated fish liver extract to flood their systems with vitamin A. This intense dietary regimen was designed to maximize the production of rhodopsin, the light-sensitive receptor protein in the retina, crucial for night vision. But this biological edge carried a severe, unsustainable cost. The physical toll of staring intensely into pitch-black horizons for hours on end caused agonizing eye strain, chronic migraines, and deep psychological fatigue. A human being cannot maintain peak visual acuity indefinitely under such immense pressure. Furthermore, no matter how rigorously trained or chemically enhanced the lookouts were, the human eye remained fundamentally limited by the biological constraints of the optic nerve and the physical curvature of the Earth. The Japanese had perfected a weapon that had already reached the absolute limit of its potential. America, meanwhile, turned away from the limitations of flesh and looked to the infinite possibilities of physics. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a clandestine facility known as the Radiation Laboratory was operating at a fever pitch. The true catalyst for this electronic revolution had arrived quietly in the autumn of 1940, hidden inside a small black briefcase carried across the Atlantic by a delegation of British scientists. Inside was a device that would change the trajectory of the war, the resonant cavity. Magnetron. This revolutionary copper block generated microwaves, radio waves, measuring mere centimeters in length. A drastic shift from the massive, clumsy metric waves of early radar systems. This was the critical leap. Microwaves could be concentrated into a tight, highly directed beam, much like a piercing spotlight, rather than a broad, floodlight-style wash of scattered energy. The Magnetron birthed the legendary SG surface search radar. Unlike the old, easily confused CXAM sets that produced a jagged, hard-to-read line on an oscilloscope, the SG radar utilized a plan position indicator, or PPI. This was the now iconic circular screen with a sweeping line of light. It painted a crisp, unmistakable, top-down map of the battlespace. The SG could pierce through heavy rain squalls, ignore the clutter of ocean swells, and clearly separate the distinct radar echoes of enemy warships from the static masses of nearby islands. It could spot a Japanese heavy cruiser at 15 miles and a submarine periscope at 3. The invisible deadly ocean was suddenly rendered perfectly visible in glowing green phosphor. Yet, this unprecedented influx of raw electronic data was completely useless without a system to interpret it. To harness the immense war-winning power of the SG radar, the United States Navy had to fundamentally restructure the architecture of command. For centuries, the nerve center of any warship had been the bridge and exposed, elevated platform where the captain relied on his own eyes, the wind on his face, and the shouted reports of his officers. In the age of the microwave, this tradition was a lethal liability. The brain of the ship was moved down, deep into the armored steel hull, into a darkened, air-conditioned compartment dubbed the Combat Information Center, or CIC. This room became the ship's new electronic nervous system. Here, the captain's biological eyes were replaced by the glowing screens of multiple radar repeaters. Plotters stood hunched over illuminated, edge-lit plexiglass boards, their greased pencils squeaking as they rapidly tracked the speed and bearing of both friendly and enemy forces in real time. Sound-powered telephones connected the CIC directly to the gun directors, the torpedo tubes, and the helm. The ship transformed from a collection of isolated weapons into a unified lethal organism. Inside this dark humming room, a young radar man staring at a cathode ray tube possessed vastly superior situational awareness than an admiral standing blindly on an open deck. The tactical advantage of the Pacific War was quietly shifting away from the men who looked fiercely at the sea, passing into the hands of the men who calmly watched the screens. The surface of the ocean was only half the battlefield. To truly own the night, the United States had to take its new electronic eyes into the freezing, oxygen-starved altitudes above. This presented a staggering engineering hurdle. A heavy cruiser could easily carry tons of radar equipment and massive generators deep within its armored hull. A carrier-based fighter plane could not. The scientists at the radiation laboratory were tasked with taking the massive room-sized radar arrays and shrinking them down to fit inside a sleek, aerodynamic fuselage. The first answer was adaptation. The rugged F-6F Hellcat was modified into the F-6F-3N and 5N night fighters, carrying a bulbous, drag-inducing radar pod grafted onto the starboard wing. But the ultimate solution was a machine designed from the ground up around the microwave magnetron, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, painted in a specialized, glossy black paint that rendered it virtually invisible to enemy searchlights. The Black Widow was an apex predator of the night sky. Housed inside its fiberglass nose cone was the SCR-720 airborne intercept radar. Inside the darkened cockpit, the dynamic of aerial combat fundamentally changed. The pilot flew the aircraft, but the radar operator, seated in a separate compartment behind him, controlled the hunt. Staring at the glowing cathode ray tube, the operator would guide the pilot through the pitch-black sky. vectoring them onto the exact altitude and heading of a Japanese bomber miles away. They stalked their prey entirely by instruments, closing the distance in absolute blindness until the faint blue flames of the enemy's engine exhaust finally flickered into view, while young American aviators were learning to read radar scopes at 300 miles an hour. The Imperial Japanese Navy High Command remained paralyzed by its own rigid traditions. It was a failure not of intellect, but of institutional humility. Japanese scientists were fully capable of understanding microwave theory. Yet, the senior admirals in Tokyo actively suppressed its rapid development. They viewed an over-reliance on electronics as a fatal symptom of Western spiritual decay. To the architects of the decisive battle doctrine, a machine that emitted active radio waves was a liability. They argued relentlessly that using radar would simply broadcast a ship's position to the enemy, completely stripping away the stealth required for their devastating torpedo attacks. Consequently, the Japanese Navy outfitted their warships with crude, metric wave sets like the Type 21 and Type 22 radars. These devices were fragile, difficult to calibrate, and entirely unsuited for precise fire control. They could offer a vague warning that ships were in the general area, but they could not direct a gun to hit them. The Japanese leadership chose to gamble the fate of their empire on the belief that the warrior's spirit, channeled through the exceptional optics of their lookouts, would always triumph over American wires and vacuum tubes. The staggering arrogance at the highest levels of command exacted a horrifying psychological toll on the Japanese sailors trapped at the bottom. For the enlisted men standing watch in the South Pacific, the night underwent a terrifying, incomprehensible transformation. Since the beginning of the war, the darkness had been their sanctuary. It was their cloak, their tactical advantage, their greatest weapon against a materially superior foe. Now the darkness actively betrayed them. To sail through the narrow, treacherous waters of the Solomon Islands or the Bismarck Sea was to endure the constant, suffocating paranoia of being watched by an invisible, silent eye. The psychological terror of this shift was absolute. Imagine the sheer, paralyzing dread of gliding through a moonless, overcast ocean, running completely darkened and perfectly silent. The highly trained lookouts are straining through their massive binoculars, seeing nothing but the black void. And then, without a single searchlight piercing the gloom, without a single flare being dropped, a barrage of American 8-inch armor-piercing shells materializes out of the sky. The heavy ordnance slams into the steel hull with terrifying mathematical precision. There is no warning. There is no visual contact. There is only the sudden blinding violence of an enemy who can somehow see through the very fabric of the night. The masters of the dark had been entirely stripped of their primary weapon, setting the stage for a brutal one-sided slaughter. August 6, 1943. The sultry, oppressive air over the Solomon Islands hangs heavy with the scent of ozone and rotting jungle vegetation. Inside the narrow, treacherous confines of Vella Gulf, the black water is dead calm. It is a moonless, overcast night. To the human eye, it is a perfect, impenetrable void. This is the ideal environment for a Japanese ambush. Captain Kaiyu Sujura sails south with a Tokyo Express force of 4 veteran destroyers, Hagikaze, Arashi, Kawakaze, and Shiger, packed with troops and supplies for the garrison at Kalimbangara. High above the bridges, his elite lookouts stand at their posts. They scan the dark horizon through their massive, starlight-gathering binoculars. They feel a familiar, supreme confidence. The night has always belonged to them, but the geometry of naval warfare has fundamentally changed. Slipping into the Gulf from the north are 6 American destroyers under the command of Commander Frederick Moosbrugger. They are not creeping blindly through the dark. They are not relying on the strained, exhausted eyes of terrified young sailors on the open bridge wings. Down in the newly organized combat information centers of the USS Dunlap, Craven and Maury. The war is being fought on screens. The glowing green sweeping line of the SG radar paints a flawless top-down map of the battle space. At precisely 23:33, the phosphor screens register 4 distinct tight pips. The range is 19,000 yards. The Japanese are completely unaware they are being watched. Inside the darkened CIC of the USS Dunlap, the atmosphere is radically different from the panicked chaos of the early war engagements. There's no shouting. There's only the low, steady hum of the electronic equipment and the quiet, clipped reports of the radar operators. The sweeping line of light clearly paints the jagged coastline of Kalimantan to the east and perfectly isolates the 4 bright blips moving south at 30 knots. The radar does not blink. It does not suffer from visual fatigue or optical illusions. It coldly tracks the trajectory of the Japanese warships with absolute mathematical precision. Commander Musbrugger, relying entirely on the data relayed from this dark room, makes a decision that permanently alters American naval doctrine in the Pacific. In the past, an American commander might have opened fire with his main battery at maximum range, blinding his own crews with brilliant muzzle flashes and instantly giving away his position. Musbrugger does not make this mistake. He trusts his electronic eyes. He will turn the Imperial Navy's greatest weapon against them. He will execute a perfect, stealthy torpedo ambush in the pitch black. Guided entirely by microwaves, he orders his column to close the distance. The American ships glide silently through the black water, closing the trap. The tension in the radar rooms is suffocating. Plotters update the bearings with grease pencils every few seconds. The range drops steadily. 15,000 yards. 10,000 yards. 8,000 yards. The Japanese lookouts, staring fiercely into the gloom, still see absolutely nothing. At 23:41, the range falls to roughly 6,000 yards. The American destroyers pivot in perfect, practiced unison. Heavy torpedo tubes swing out to starboard. The order is given. Without firing a single star shell, without a single illuminating searchlight piercing the dark, the American destroyers unleash a massive, coordinated spread of 24 Mark 15 torpedoes into the void. Immediately after the heavy steel fish drop into the water, Musbrugger orders a hard turn away. The American ships vanish back into the safety of the darkness, leaving no visual trace of their presence. For several agonizing minutes, the torpedoes run silently toward their targets. On the bridge of the Hagikaze, the first warning comes far too late. A lookout screams, frantically pointing at the phosphorescent wakes streaking through the black water just yards from the hull. There is absolutely no time to maneuver. At 23:45, the night completely shatters. Torpedoes slam violently into Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze. The detonations are catastrophic. Magazines ignite in blinding flashes. High-pressure boilers rupture, sending geysers of superheated steam into the sky. Columns of fire hundreds of feet high illuminate the Gulf, turning the suffocating night into a terrifying, lethal day. The 3 veteran destroyers are instantly gutted, their backs broken by the massive underwater shockwaves. They begin to sink rapidly into the flaming oil. Only the Shigure miraculously survives. A dud torpedo strikes her rudder but fails to detonate, allowing her to limp away in terror into the blackness. In less than 12 minutes, without receiving a single scratch or firing a single primary gun, the United States Navy has annihilated a seasoned Japanese destroyer force. The resulting explosions represent more than just a physical destruction of steel and flesh. They signal the complete, violent collapse of a naval philosophy. For years, the Imperial Navy had built its entire strategic framework around the assumption that the dark would always hide them. Now burning fiercely in the waters of Vella Gulf, that assumption is rendered permanently obsolete. The invincible masters of the night have been slaughtered in the dark by an enemy they never even saw. And the electronic net that closed around Captain Tsujura's destroyers is about to be cast much wider, preparing to drag the very pride of the Japanese battleship fleet down into the abyss. 14 months later, that net would drag the very pride of the Japanese battleship fleet down into the abyss. October 24, 1944, the Philippines. Vice Admiral Shoshi Nishimura sails his southern force toward the narrow, treacherous bottleneck of Surigao Strait. He commands a classic, heavy surface action group. The massive dreadnoughts Yamashiro and Fusu, their towering pagoda masts scraping the night sky, are supported by the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. Nishimura is operating under the old sacred doctrine. He believes the dark is his ally. He expects to punch through the strait, rely on the supreme optics of his seasoned lookouts, and fall upon the vulnerable American invasion fleet anchored at Lady Gulf. Waiting for him in the blackness is Kukukun. The Vokness is Vodko, American invasion fleet, anchored at Lady Gulf. Waiting for him in the blackness is Woodcall Kwan. The Vokner of the blackness is Votata. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Oldendorf commands a devastating array of firepower: 39 PT boats, 28 destroyers, 8 cruisers, and 6 heavy battleships. 5 of these American Leviathans are ghosts. They are the resurrected victims of Pearl Harbor, the USS West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. They have been raised from the mud, completely rebuilt, and fundamentally transformed. They are no longer blind. They bristle with the finest microwave fire control radars the scientists at the radiation laboratory could produce. Nishimura pushes north into the suffocating dark. It is the early hours of October 25th. The American trap springs in precise lethal stages. First, the PT boats swarm the flanks, using their rudimentary radars to harass the column. Then, the American destroyers execute a flawless coordinated torpedo ambush. The dark water erupts. The battleship Fuso takes massive underwater hits, falls out of formation, and violently blows apart, snapping in half. 3 Japanese destroyers are systematically gutted by the wakeless steel fish. Despite the catastrophic losses, Nishimura refuses to turn back. He pushes the surviving flagship Yamashiro, the burning Mogami, and the lone destroyer Shiger relentlessly forward. He is sailing blindly into the ultimate naval nightmare, a perfectly crossed T. At the northern end of the strait, Oldendorf's battle line steams slowly back and forth, their massive broadsides facing the approaching Japanese column. The time is 3:51. The distance is 22,000 yards. High on the bridge of the Yamashiro, the lookouts strain their eyes through their massive binoculars. They see nothing but the burning wreckage of their own ships behind them and the pitch-black horizon ahead. The American battle line is completely invisible in the heavy, smoke-choked night, but deep inside the armored citadels of the American battleships, the war is being fought on illuminated screens. The Mark 8 fire control radar, utilizing advanced phase comparison technology, locks onto the massive, undeniable return of the Yamashiro. The invisible microwave pulse travels at the speed of light, bounces off the Japanese dreadnought steel superstructure, and returns to the American receivers, inside the plotting rooms. Heavy mechanical analog computers hum with lethal purpose. The radar data is fed directly into the Ford Mark 1 fire control computer. Gears grind and cams spin, instantly calculating the range, course, speed, and even the necessary adjustments for the curvature of the Earth and the rotation of the planet. The massive 14 and 16-inch gun barrels automatically elevate and train, smoothly slave to the radar's unblinking lock. The American gunners do not need to visually identify the enemy. They only need to trust the machine. At 3:53, the order is given. The American battle line opens fire. The night instantly shatters. The sheer concussive force of the synchronized broadsides pushes the heavy American dreadnoughts sideways in the water. Mountains of blinding propellant flash turn the overcast sky a terrifying brilliant orange. Thousands of yards away, the Yamashiro is engulfed in an apocalyptic hailstorm of armor-piercing shells. It is not a battle. It is an execution. Tons of high explosive, guided flawlessly through the dark by microwave beams, plunge through the Yamashiro's armored decks. The Japanese flagship is bludgeoned without mercy. Her towering pagoda mast is smashed. Her turrets are silenced. Fires rage uncontrollably across her ruined superstructure. Nishimura and his elite lookouts are subjected to the horrifying, incomprehensible reality of push-button warfare. They are being mathematically erased from existence by an enemy they still cannot physically see. The Yamashiro absorbs an impossible amount of punishment before finally capsizing and sinking at 419, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura and nearly her entire crew to the bottom. The last battleship-to-battleship engagement in human history has been decided entirely by invisible waves. The tactical supremacy of the Imperial Japanese Navy is irrevocably broken. As dawn slowly breaks over the oil-slicked, debris-choked waters of Surigao Strait, the sheer, unmitigated scale of the slaughter forces both sides to confront a chilling new reality. The morning of October 25, 1944, reveals a gruesome, unvarnished truth across the surface of Surigao Strait. As the tropical sun slowly burns away the heavy night overcast, the waters are choked with a thick, suffocating sludge of bunker oil. The sea is utterly silent, save for the crackle of burning debris and the gentle wash of the tide against floating wreckage. The mighty southern force of the Imperial Japanese Navy has simply ceased to exist. Where a column of proud, heavily armed warships sailed only hours before, there is now only a sprawling graveyard of shattered steel. The butcher's bill is staggering, a dark testament to the cold mathematical efficiency of radar-directed annihilation. Vice Admiral Shoshi Nishimura is dead, entombed within the twisted, inverted hull of his flagship, the Yamashiro. The dreadnought Fusu lies completely severed in two sunken halves. The heavy cruiser Mogami is a crippled, burning ruin that will be mercifully scuttled by her own fleet before the day is over. 3 veteran destroyers, Michishio, Yamagumo, and Asagumo, have been obliterated. Over 4,000 Imperial Japanese Navy sailors have perished in the dark, slaughtered by an enemy they could not see, fight, or comprehend. In stark, terrifying contrast, the American battle line remains entirely untouched. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's massive fleet has suffered practically zero combat casualties from Japanese fire, losing only a single PT boat to the darkness and suffering damage to the destroyer USS Albert W. Grant, tragically, mostly the result of friendly fire in the chaotic final minutes of the torpedo ambush. Deep inside the armored hulls of the American battleships, the radar operators simply watch the bright green pips on their scopes fade and vanish. The engagement was not a battle, it was a clinical, one-sided massacre. It represents the absolute pinnacle of naval gunnery and the definitive fatal triumph of electronics over human optics. As the sole surviving Japanese destroyer, the Shiger, limps away into the morning haze, she carries with her a terrifying, paradigm-shifting message for the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The doctrine of Yasen, the sacred art of the night attack that Japan had spent decades meticulously perfecting, is dead. The thousands of hours spent torturing the eyes of their lookouts, the intense vitamin-heavy diets, the massive optical rangefinders, the silent and deadly long-lance torpedoes, all of it has been rendered entirely, violently obsolete by a copper block that generates invisible microwaves. The sword of the Imperial Navy has been snapped in half. The psychological shockwaves of this defeat ripple through the highest echelons of the Japanese command, shattering their deeply held martial myths. Intercepted communications and post-war interrogations reveal a profound, paralyzing despair taking root among the surviving officer corps. Captain Tameichi Hara, a legendary Japanese destroyer commander, would later write with bitter clarity about the sheer futility of their tactics against the American electronic wall. The Japanese finally understand far too late that pure samurai spirit cannot deflect a radar beam. Institutional hubris has blinded them to a technological revolution, and now they are paying the ultimate price in oceans of blood. The night, once their most trusted ally and impenetrable cloak, has been permanently weaponized against them. They are no longer the apex predators of the Pacific. They are the prey. The United States Navy has effectively stripped the Imperial fleet of its offensive capabilities, reducing the surviving Japanese warships to terrified fugitives, paralyzed by the thought of leaving port after sunset. But the destruction of the Japanese surface fleet is only the beginning of the nightmare. The American mastery of the microwave does not stop at the shoreline. The invisible, unblinking eyes of the United States military are preparing to look upward. The horrific radar-directed slaughter that just purged the waters of the Philippines is about to be unleashed across the skies of the Japanese home islands, carrying the terror of the night directly to the heart of the empire. That terror arrives on the wings of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. By the winter of 1944, the Mariana Islands have fallen to the Allies, providing the United States Army Air Forces with sprawling coral runways entirely within striking distance of Tokyo. Initially, the strategic bombing campaign mirrors the European theater, relying on high-altitude daylight precision strikes using the legendary Norden bombsight. However, this optical instrument requires clear skies and visual target identification. The skies over the Japanese home islands are notoriously shielded by dense, persistent cloud cover and ferocious, unpredictable jet stream winds. Visual bombing proves practically impossible. The heavy ordnance is scattered blindly across the landscape. The solution, once again, is found in the mastery of the microwave. The B-29 is designed not just as a heavy bomber, but as an airborne electronics laboratory. Tucked securely within its pressurized aluminum fuselage, housed in a retractable dome between the bomb bays, is the NAPQ-13 ground scanning radar. Sitting in a darkened compartment behind the cockpit, the radar operator watches the geography of the Japanese home islands paint itself across his cathode ray tube. Through solid overcast and pitch-black skies, coastlines, twisting rivers, and sprawling industrial complexes glow in unmistakable high-contrast green. The bombardier no longer needs to physically see the Earth. The machine maps it for him with unblinking precision. When Major General Curtis LeMay takes command of the 21 Bomber Command, he completely rewrites the strategic playbook. Recognizing the futility of high-altitude daylight raids, he strips the B-29s of their heavy defensive machine guns to increase their bomb capacity and orders them to attack at night at drastically lower altitudes. Operation Meeting House, the devastating firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, is guided through the black sky entirely by these invisible electronic beams. Navigators use the radar returns of the Sumida River to perfectly time the release of thousands of tons of M69 incendiary clusters, initiating a synchronized, apocalyptic firestorm. Down below, the Japanese defenders are thrust into a state of absolute, terrifying paralysis. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service desperately scrambles twin-engine night fighters, like the Nakajima J-1N Gecko, to intercept the incoming Silver Armadas, but they are flying utterly blind. Their cockpits lack effective miniaturized interception radar. The Japanese pilots are forced to rely on the exact same biological limitations that doomed their naval lookouts in the Solomon Islands, straining their naked eyes into the dark, desperately hoping to catch the faint blue exhaust glow of an American bomber in the moonlight. Ground-based searchlights sweep the sky frantically, but they cannot penetrate the heavy smoke of the burning cities or reliably track aircraft moving at over 300 miles per hour in the dark. Meanwhile, American night fighters like the heavily armed P-61 Black Widow now actively hunt directly over Japanese airfields. They loiter patiently in the blackness, completely invisible to the enemy below. Their advanced SCR-720 radars track Japanese planes the precise moment their wheels lift off the runway. The Black Widow pilots simply follow the glowing pips on their scopes, closing in silently from behind to unleash devastating bursts of 20mm cannon fire. The hunted have become the hunters, and the former masters of the night have been completely blinded in their own airspace. The Japanese military and industrial infrastructure is methodically dismantled by an adversary it cannot physically engage. The factories producing their weapons, the ports housing their surviving ships, and the cities sheltering their workforce are systematically erased from the map by fleets operating entirely beyond the spectrum of human vision. The agonizing multi-year transition is finally complete. The empire that once confidently claimed absolute dominion over the night sky now cowers beneath it, waiting helplessly for the low thrumming drone of Wright cyclone engines and the sudden invisible rain of fire. The darkness no longer offers shelter. It only hides the executioner. This invisible executioner was born not from a sudden shift in courage or martial spirit, but from a fundamental, irreversible redefinition of human perception. The Second World War marked the exact moment in history when our biological senses ceased to be the primary instruments of survival and conquest. For millennia, a warrior's capability was strictly bound by the physical limits of what they could see, hear, and endure. The Imperial Japanese Navy took this ancient visceral paradigm to its absolute zenith. They pushed the human body and the science of polished glass to their absolute breaking points, breeding a generation of sailors who truly believed their sheer willpower could conquer the physical void of the ocean. They molded themselves into the ultimate biological weapons, but flesh, bone, and discipline have immovable boundaries. The introduction of the cavity magnetron and microwave radar shattered those boundaries forever. The glowing green phosphor of the cathode ray tube permanently replaced the strained, weeping eyes of the lookout. The cold, clinical hum of the Combat Information Center superseded the chaotic, wind-swept bridge. Combat was irrevocably severed from human line of sight. This was the quiet, terrifying birth of the modern battlefield. It ushered in an era of push-button annihilation, a sterile reality where the enemy was no longer a dark silhouette on the horizon, but a glowing mathematical coordinate swept by a line of light. It removed the visceral intimacy from the hunt, replacing the primal terror of the unseen with the cold, unyielding certainty of physics. Today, this electronic legacy dictates the terms of global security. It lives on in every orbital satellite, every stealth aircraft, and every guided missile tracking targets far beyond the curvature of the Earth. The tragic, enduring irony of the Pacific War remains permanently etched into the history of human conflict. The Japanese fought fiercely, sacrificing thousands of their finest sailors to master the shadows of the night. But the Americans simply engineered a way to render the shadows obsolete. The proud, unyielding gaze of the human warrior was finally, inevitably, blinded by the unblinking eye of the machine.